Said if everyone who is not the speaker can mute, I think we can avoid all the feedback. So that would be great. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second session in our virtual Vernal Pools. For those of you who missed our first session, we are hosting 5 of these talks on the following dates on multiple vernal pool topics. All of our recordings are going to be available on the Ohio Wetlands Association's YouTube channel, and the first one is up for you to check out. For each session, our speaker or speakers for this week will present for about 45 to 50 minutes and then take a few minutes for questions. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat and we'll get to them either during the presentation or afterwards if we can. We're going to wait until all 4 presenters are done and then we'll field questions just to keep things moving smoothly. The last 15 minutes are going to be video footage of our virtual field trip sites. This is the start of the active season for vernal pools. So if you tuned in the last session, you're going to be very surprised with how different these sites look. So this week, we have an introduction into the educational modules of the Ohio Vernal Pool Network. These have been created to help provide a packet for vernal pool education to any community in Ohio. You can visit the network's website to learn more. These modules will be part of the in-person conference lineup in the 2022 Vernal Pools, but for this year, our 4 presenters are going to give you a small preview of some of the modules. So this week, our first 3 presenters, Logan, Jenny, and Jenna, all work for Mad Scientist Associates over in Westerville, Ohio. And our final presenter, Ray Stewart, is a retired public school science teacher who founded Ohio Wetlands Association, where he currently volunteers as ambassador. Ray is also a certified interpretive guide and a master rain gardener. So I'm going to hand it over to Logan and you can screen share and go ahead.
All righty. Let's see if I can get this to pop up here. Perfect. Everybody can see that okay, correct? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Logan Dunn, and I'm an environmental technician for Mad Scientist Associates. And I'm also a board member for the Ohio Wetlands Association. And today I'm going to give a very brief topic on vernal pool ecology. So without further ado, what is a vernal pool? First, it is a wetland. It has wetland hydrology. Now, wetland hydrology refers to the seasonality and extent of flooding within each of these pools. It has hydric soils. Hydric soils are those soils that are exposed to prolonged periods of inundation and often lack oxygen type qualities, and the chemical processes within these types of soils are very different than any other habitat type. Vernal pools also have wetland plants. Now these plants are specifically adapted to standing water and very saturated type conditions versus upland plants, which are very dramatically in the way that those soils lack inundation of water and saturated soils and that sort of thing. So there are 6 vernal pool characteristics that I want to touch on a little bit, each of them vary greatly in characteristics. The first being the surrounding habitat is forested. The second being seasonal hydrology. Third being geographically isolated hydrology. Microhabitat, microtopography, limited predators, and obligate organisms. So we'll touch base on each one of these individually here. The surrounding habitat forested, typically vernal pools will be found within forested areas, but they can oftentimes be found along forested edges and within shrublands. Trees provide leaves and woody debris for inputs into the food web and also shade during the summer months, which help regulate water temperatures and also inhibit some vegetative growth. Amphibians, as you know, spend much of their lives in forests, such as our state salamander. The spotted salamander can travel up to 200 meters to a pool, and wood frogs can travel up to 1,000 meters to a pool to breed. And with wood frogs, this kind of generally means that they need about 776 acres of forested habitat surrounding vernal pools, which is very special and unique. Seasonal hydrology. In the wintertime, it fills with water from snow melt as we get later on into the season. And in the spring, we begin to see some of the precipitation and rainfall events, which is typically the highest point of water in vernal pools. And then as we get into the summer months, we begin to see more drier light conditions, such as the one pictured here. And then we get into the fall season, which we may receive some more precipitation. And again, the pools may start filling back up again. They have geographically isolated hydrology. Now, what this means is they don't have a continuous flow of water into the system by rivers, lakes, or streams. They're very isolated from those systems. Although some vernal pools may receive some water influx from rivers that may overflow their stream banks. But primarily the precipitation or the water influx into vernal pools comes from precipitation, runoff, and groundwater. Microhabitat and microtopography. Here, micro meaning small. Small habitat between clumps of moss or bark of trees provide unique habitat for vernal pool species, and amphibians will often lay their eggs on sticks within the pool just beneath the water level. Trees, as you know, during wind throw events and things like that, will often topple over and create small depressional areas and small little vernal pool habitat types as well. Obligate organisms within the pool, they require drying or other special conditions found only in vernal pools. Buttonbush, for instance, can stand standing water and really moist soil conditions during the summer. Fairy shrimp are kind of delicate morsels for predators within the vernal pool habitats. And then you have your Jefferson salamanders, which typically lay their eggs like other amphibians, and then they quickly grow into tadpoles, and then they develop legs and lungs shortly before the vernal pools tend to dry out. We also have our predaceous diving beetle here in the far right corner, which are kind of unique little insects in the fact that they are air breathers, but they can also sustain prolonged periods of time underwater. So where do you find these vernal pools? All throughout Ohio, you'll find a variety of locations suitable for vernal pool habitat, generally rural areas, but it wouldn't be uncommon to find them within a larger, smaller complexes as well. So this picture here kind of depicts a complex of pond and a wetland and also vernal pool habitat type. So there in the far right corner up at the top there, you'll notice some standing water there. That kind of represents the ponding of the habitat type there. And then obviously to the far right in the center there and to the left of it, so the right two arrows below the top arrow there represent your vernal pool habitats. And then to the far left, you'll notice some marbling within agricultural fields there, and they kind of will most likely represent previously wetland habitat that's consistent with hydric soils in those conditions. So those are generally wetlands that have been drained over the time, or areas that are prone to wetland restoration projects as well. Threats to vernal pools. Obviously, development's a big threat to vernal pools from the agricultural industry, residential, and commercial development. Regulation is a big issue with vernal pools too, in the fact that vernal pools typically only have intermittent or groundwater connections to other waters, limiting protections. Climate change can affect pools too, because obviously that changes the seasonality of rainfall, and can oftentimes, if it leads to more drier conditions in the spring, that'll affect development of the amphibian species within those pools. Invasive species are a big issue, outcompeting native vegetation that are host plants for a variety of species. And also vernal pools are very difficult to recreate to their once original condition. So it's something to consider as well. And that kind of concludes my short presentation. So I will pass the baton on to Jenna.
Thanks, Logan. We'll actually be going to Jenny next, and she will share her screen here in a moment.
Okay, sorry about that. I had an issue getting my Zoom screen back up. All right. All right, can you guys see my screen? Okay, audio's good? Okay. So thanks for there we go. Okay, so I'm Jenny Adkins from Mad Scientist Associates, and this is a very condensed version of the Plants of Vernal Pools module that you would receive if you opted to acquire that package. And I kind of wanted to give you a snippet of the different plants that we would see in the strata of vernal pools, and as well as give you a primer of what you may or may not see. So many of you, I assume, are familiar with vernal pools and that they are unique and that they don't really have that many plants growing inside of them. That's one of the indicators that you're looking at a seasonal vernal pool versus a more permanent type of wetland feature. And the picture on the bottom is very characteristic of something that you might come across in a woodland where you see some water-stained leaves or some muddy areas. There's not a lot of plants growing there. You see that definitive line of green to brown. And that is telling you that water has been sitting there for a prolonged period. We call it a sparsely vegetated concave surface. You want to look for water-stained leaves. So that's just leaves that haven't fully decomposed yet. So they've been sitting underwater and they look a lot darker than the ones that you would see that are getting exposure to air. You can see silt deposits, meaning that the water has risen high enough to leave silt on the leaves and trees nearby. You can also see watermarks on tree trunks, which is a dark coloration that you would see on a tree trunk, indicating that water has been sitting there. And then other things that you can look for are tussocky clumps of plants, which just means there's little humps of vegetation growing. That's really good habitat for some of the creatures that like to visit these pools. Also large stands of shrubs. Often you'll see buttonbush, which we'll talk about later. Some blueberry or winterberry, some viburnums, etc. And then in this picture, you can slightly tell that there's the buttressing at the base of that tree trunk, and that's also a morphological adaptation that the plants have to deal with the amount of water that they're sitting in, help stabilize them. Also coarse woody debris, indicating that some trees may have died or fallen, and they provide really good habitat.
Hey, Jenny.
Yeah.
I wanted to let you know real quick that your presenter mode is what is showing instead of the presentation mode. So we're seeing the slide and then the next
Oh,
slide.
shoot. Sorry, guys. Let me see if I can switch that. That's the issue that I was having before, that my screen was coming up. I have two monitors, you guys, and that's for some reason stuck on the other one. Let me see if I can.
I think when you click share, you have the, so I usually put it in presentation mode to begin with. And then when you click share, you can choose the screen.
Okay. Okay, let me switch screens here. Sorry, this is my first real snafu, you guys, with Zoom. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the heads up. All right, so, oh good, I have this picture up here. So the true vernal pool vegetation is that really there's not a lot there to see. In the summertime when things are green, you will see a lot of sedges and grasses along the edges of the pool, or maybe in like little hummocks where you have a slight rise in the topography. But in the bottom of the pool, you won't see that much. And the small inset picture there is what the pool might look like later in the season when the water has receded. And you can see both the watermark on the tree, that's that dark stain, as well as the moss trim line, which I didn't mention earlier, but that's saying, or kind of showing you that the moss will only grow so far into the water. So you can tell that there was at least a foot of water there. Here's another picture of what you might see, a lot of white grass, which is the kind of delicate grass in the right side, and some ash. So it's just telling you that the water was much deeper in the center versus a little bit drier towards the edge. And are plants important to vernal pools? If you don't have a lot of them there, you know, what's their purpose? Well, they are very important. They provide the structure for all of the little itty bitty creatures that come to these pools, provide shelter and food for them. The plants also help regulate that very shallow water, keeping it cool and from overheating. It also assists in preventing evapotranspiration. And when we are looking at it, if you're a plant person, you can tell by the types of plants that you're seeing what type of water you're seeing there and the type of soil and bedrock you might have. So whether it's alkaline and you have high pH there, you'll have certain plants that would grow versus more acidic loving species. And skunk cabbage, which is a fan favorite, I think, of vernal pools. Those only grow where you have cool flowing groundwater. And depending on the types of plants that you find, some of them are really disturbance tolerant, and some of them, like mentioned above in those bullet points, they will only grow in very undisturbed areas. So that can give you a clue that you're looking at a really high quality vernal pool if you run across something like skunk cabbage or some other very nice species. And so in the full module, we go through each of these different strata. So trees, shrubs, and then forbs and graminoids, which would be in the herbaceous layer. And I will go through one of each category with you today, just kind of the top ones that you might be familiar with. Starting with the trees, we have American elm. And I wanted to keep this one in versus an oak species, just because this really is one of the most common ones that you're going to find, even though they're fairly short-lived because of the Dutch elm disease. You're not going to see a lot of mature elms, but you will see them as full trees. And they are a facultative wet species, meaning that they are most often found in wetlands. They can grow in standing water, but very often they'll be growing right on the edge where you see that gradient transition from standing water to just saturated soils. They have an alternating branch pattern. So their buds, leaves, stems, all of that tends to grow in like a stair-step arrangement. Their leaves are very sharply toothed, as you can see in that image. It looks kind of like a serrated knife. And also, if you were to feel the leaves, they would feel very rough, like sandpaper. And the bark, I do have a little inset there. If you were to peel off a little bit of bark, it's a very spongy type of cambium. You would see this distinct layering of light, dark, light, dark. And to me, that looks like a bologna sandwich. Some people call it an Oreo, but that alternating light dark pattern is indicative of an American elm, which is the wetter species of the two that you're likely to see in Ohio. Moving on to shrubs, another fan favorite is buttonbush. This can form large colonies or it can grow singly. It's also very adaptable. So if you really like this plant and you want to introduce it to a rain garden or your yard, it can tolerate drier soils as well. But most often you find it in inundated wetlands. It's got a beautiful spherical flower, and it's really well visited by lepidopteran species as well as bees. And I'm not sure if hummingbirds visit this as well, but it really attracts pollinators. This, in contrast to the elm, has an opposite branch pattern. So the buds, leaves, and twigs come off of the stem opposing one another, as you can see in that twig picture that I have. And the bark has a lot of white lenticels on it, which is something that a plant uses to cope with inundation and gas exchange. So that's often very common in wetland plants. So it just looks like it's speckled with white dots. And this is often indicative of a really high quality wetland. Even though I said it's adaptable, when you see it growing in a large stand, you know that you're looking at something that has been there for a while. And it provides really good habitat for breeding amphibians, where they can perch on the twigs and call to one another. They can attach their eggs to it, etc. So it's a really, really nice plant to have. Moving on to forbs, I chose this one even though it's not a showy forb by any means. You wouldn't even notice the flowers probably if you were walking past it, but this is false nettle. So this will not sting you like stinging nettle or tall nettle, but it looks very much like that. It is a flowering plant, it's a forb. And I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but I'm going to point to the flowers that are coming off of the axils along the stem. So these little stalks of green flowers, and you can see these in the winter. They'll kind of stay persistent on that stem, so you can tell this plant in the summer or the winter. This almost exclusively grows in kind of patchy shade or shady wetland areas, and it's most often associated with vernal pools. So know that you're safe to touch this one if you have shorts or exposed arms and you're exploring. Oh, and I wanted to mention this looks very similar to clearweed as well. That's the last note that I have here. This clearweed is a little bit shorter, and it has a stem that is almost translucent. It looks very succulent, and if you break it, it's very watery on the insides. So it could be confused with that, but the false nettle is a little bit larger. And the graminoids, I put mostly sedges because there's some characteristic plants that grow in vernal pools that are of the sedge variety. You have some grasses as well, but what I have in the picture here is Carex bromoides, so the brome-like sedge. These are perennial plants, and the little green tussocks that we mentioned earlier that looks like little green humps of plants, each one of those is an individual sedge. And on the bottom picture, you can see the inflorescence. And if you're not familiar with sedges, these are the flowers, as well as the seed is inside each one of those little paragynia pods. These also provide really, really good habitat for creatures that need to hang on to a stem that's in the water or attach their eggs to it. And you will see this blooming very soon, so April and May. And it's very common, but it's when you see large colonies of it, that is probably indicative that you're looking at a nicer quality vernal pool as well. And then something else, you do have trees that grow in the wetland area, but in a lot of circumstances, when you're looking at a vernal pool, you're really going to see the trees that are growing along the perimeter of it. So they like to get their feet wet, but they don't really want to be in that standing water. And this is a list of the very typical species that you'll run into around vernal pools. Some of them are true wetland species, and some of them are actually upland plants, but they can just hang with a little bit of wet feet during the spring. And that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer questions now if I have time, or at the end.
It looks like we don't have any in the chat at the moment, so we can jump over to our next presenter, which is Jenna.
All right, thanks everybody. Let's see, I'll share my screen here. Can everyone see that all right?
It doesn't look like it's sharing yet.
How about now?
There we go.
Okay, great. So my name's Jenna Odegard. I work here at Mad Scientist Associates, and my specialty is in aquatic ecology. And I've studied macroinvertebrates for about 10 years or so. And I'm excited to share this module with you that you would get with the OVPN Vernal Pool educational package. So in this picture here is a dragonfly emerging from an exuvia. So that's the kind of shell-like body here. And the dragonfly emerges as is typically thought of. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail further on. So in general, macroinvertebrates are known to be able to be seen with your naked eye, visible without a microscope, although we use that to identify in more detail to species and things like that. But these are known as insects, crustaceans, clams, worms, a variety of critters. And they're quite diverse, but in general, they can be termed as aquatic bugs or insects. And so this is kind of a breakdown. We have the diversity of mammals here on the left, and shows from monkeys all the way to kangaroos how many different orders there are. And then if we compare that on the right to orders of macroinvertebrate, you can see there's just as much diversity. So this is a huge group of organisms, some really interesting adaptations that make them able to live in vernal pools where there's only seasonal water and some unique resources for them. So I'm going to jump into one of the largest macroinvertebrates. This is the crayfish group, or Decapoda. And there are two common types of crayfish that live in vernal pools. This includes the digger crayfish and the devil crayfish. And you can often determine if crayfish are present by these chimneys. Crayfish burrow down into the ground, and they will leave these chimneys of silt, kind of showing where their holes are. So if you see these, it's pretty clear that there is a crayfish there, or at least was recently. This is a picture of the digger crayfish. This is almost as big as the devil crayfish. They can get over 3.5 inches long. And the swamp darner is close to that. It can get up to 3¼ inches long, I believe, as an adult. And this is that aquatic life stage that I mentioned before. This is a dragonfly nymph. And these are really interesting predators. You may see them attached to vegetation like this. And if you get a close-up view of the mouth, you can see it has a hinge-like mouth. So this part here folds down, and then it can actually extend like its elbow and pull its prey into its mouth. And yes, this is Ohio's largest dragonfly, over 3 inches, really pretty blue and green coloration on the body. And next is the fairy shrimp. So these are vernal pool obligates, kind of a favorite to see as far as macroinvertebrates go in the vernal pools. And these require those fishless waters so that fish cannot predate on the eggs. They have a pretty short lifespan and a dry phase, and their eggs actually wait until there's water to develop. So it's a pretty interesting process called diapause, and makes them very successful in vernal pools. You may see them swimming upside down, and these are a key link between primary producers and predators. And then we have a resource here that you could also share with the people that you're presenting this to. The package includes some videos and information about mosquitoes. Often people worry that if they have wetlands or vernal pools, they're just breeding mosquitoes, which are a nuisance to people. And we like to explain that if you have a healthy balance in your ecosystem, other predators like bats and things are going to, or other macroinvertebrates that live in the vernal pool are going to feed off these things, and nothing's really going to become dominant. It's when you have that disturbance or pollution where one thing really overtakes the system. So we kind of share some of that information, as well as what you can do to reduce the nuisance of mosquitoes. Here are some suggestions, like removing water from your rain barrels, and cleaning out your roof gutters and things like that. All right, let's move on to the caddisfly larva. So this is one of my favorite and just a really cool organism. These turn into a caddisfly, so there's a wide diversity of these as well. But the interesting part about these is that they use materials that are present in their habitat, and they create cases. So often we don't have these jewels in a stream, but if we did, they would make cases like that. I'm actually wearing a caddisfly case necklace today. So they're kind of fun. You can use nature to as jewelry. And so that's what this picture represents. These in general are sensitive to water quality issues. So if there's pollution, you'll see a decrease in this this order, Trichopteran. And we have a variety of pictures of these caddisflies using different materials. So whether it's rocks, stones, and snail shells, leaves, some other sticks, and other large shells. So those are a fun one. I think I only have a couple minutes left, but I'll just touch on two more orders. So this is Collembola, and these are wingless insects. These are also known as the springtails. And these are pretty unique creatures in the fact that they have this furcula at the back of their body, and they can launch themselves far distances, the equivalent of a man jumping across a football field. So you may see them as these snow fleas, or sometimes termed as snow fleas, and then it will be gone, and it's because it jumped so far. One other really odd organism is the water bear. And these are technically not macroinvertebrates. These are micro, you need a microscope to see them. But these are able to live in very extreme environments, freezing temperatures, and lack of water and oxygen and things like that, some of which animals have to cope with in vernal pools. So they kind of look like they should be from outer space or something. So that is a little introduction to the vernal pool macroinvertebrates. And now we will switch it over to Ray, and he'll share about iNaturalist. Perhaps. Oh, stop share.
Would you rewind and start at the beginning? There you go.
Oh, Ray, you're gonna want to unmute. We can't hear.
The video, I don't hear the video.
Yeah, it's really quiet. Oh, Lacey's saying you need to share sound. It should be an option at the top under the 3 dots.
Okay, thanks. Let me try that. All right, I'm gonna give it another try. I'll start it at the beginning.
Hello, Ray Stewart here with an introduction to using iNaturalist for the Ohio Vernal Pool Network. I'd like to begin with what you can do to get started before you go out into the field. So you need to collect a few things to take with you. First thing you're going to want is a smartphone. So if you've got one of these, this is wonderful. It makes the work so much easier. You download the iNaturalist app onto your phone. You make sure that you have an account set up and it is ready to go. That will save you a lot of trouble. You can take pictures with this, you can do sound recordings with your phone, and you can submit your observations directly from your phone without any intermediate step. Now, if you don't have a smartphone, if you would rather make observations using a camera or with a sound recorder, that's perfectly fine too. And then another step involved when you get to a computer, then you can transfer those files and upload those to your iNaturalist account, making sure to designate the Ohio Vernal Pool Network project on iNaturalist. And then it will be as contributing to our project. Another thing that you're going to want, we want air temperature and water temperature recorded, and there's a little form when you submit your observation to include that. I like to use this infrared thermometer. It's quick and easy. All you have to do is point and click, and it will read out your temperature on the little screen here. These are not terribly expensive. Make sure that you calibrate it for Celsius because we want all of our data to be in metric. I also highly recommend that you have a pair of boots to wear out into the field. Something like these muck boots are very handy, work well in most circumstances. However, they might not be tall enough for every vernal pool out there. So in some occasions, I prefer to go out with these hip waders. They come up to my hip and well over my knee. I'm very secure. Unlikely that I'm going to get into water any deeper than these hip waders will cover. So one or the other, but be careful either way because you don't want to be walking out of the vernal pool with a boot full of water. In addition, for taking samples of macroinvertebrates in the water itself, it is handy to have a dip net. One of our target species is fairy shrimp, and they can be hard to see sometimes, but if you use a dip net like this, you can sweep this through the water, covering a fair amount of territory, and then see what it is that has come up in your net. I like to take a little tub along with me because then I can sweep with the dip net and knock it into the tub, and I can see what it is that I swept up with the net. In addition, we want to have a measurement of how deep the water is in the vernal pool. So part of that is to seek out where it may be the deepest, and then take a depth there. If not, at least wherever it is that you are sampling and making observations, measure the depth of the vernal pool there. And that can be done if you take a ruler along with you. Again, make sure that it is calibrated in metric, so a meter stick would be very handy. But I have another choice that I make. I've taken the handle of my dip net and I've calibrated it in metric measurements. I have a line that I have put on here and marks indicating every 1/10 of a meter. I can use that to estimate the depth of the water that I'm in and then report that in centimeters. So if I know that I'm up to 3 decimeters and about halfway to the next, that's 3.5 decimeters, also known as 35 centimeters. It's not that hard. I'm marking my dip net as a meter stick so that I can use this to measure the depth of the water that I'm standing in. And I'm going to burn a mark at every 1/10 of a meter along here. You may want to take some kind of field guide with you to help identify what it is that you are seeing in the field. I recommend Ohio's Hidden Wonders, a guide to the plants and animals of vernal pools, available only from Ohio Wetlands Association. And also, before you go out, you want to make sure that your equipment is clean and disinfected. So that means your dip net should be cleaned, not just rinsed off, which is a good start, but you want to disinfect it. So I use a solution, a dilute solution of household laundry Clorox and water in a ratio of 32:1. Now this tall kitchen garbage can, I've got 6 gallons of water in that. So that means 3 cups of Clorox go in that, and that will give you the right ratio to disinfect. And you should, I don't want to hit the ceiling with this, you should get the whole thing wet and soaked. Yes, there, and soaked. And then when you pull it out, Oh, that is low ceiling. You should leave the Clorox solution on there for 5 minutes before you rinse it off. I know it might be a little smelly, but that will make sure that it is disinfected. You don't want to just rinse it off right away. Also, boots. And for sure, you want to make sure that you're scrubbing any old mud off of that. Get seeds off of it if they're stuck on there. Clean that off, and then follow the same procedure where you can just dip in Clorox, dilute Clorox solution, and then let it stay on there for about 5 minutes. And that will make sure that you're not spreading disease from one wetland to another. Collect 4 data points. When you first get out to the field, first assess the size of the vernal pool you're about to monitor. Walk its perimeter. Figure out where the extent of the vernal pool is. Then, to the best of your ability, determine the order of magnitude of size of that vernal pool using these images as guidelines. Of course, if you have a more precise way of measuring the area of your vernal pool, you're welcome to submit that data instead. So while I'm in the pool sampling, I can easily take the depth of the water here with my calibrated dip net and putting it in right here. I know it's pretty deep. Glad I've got the hip waders on. And it goes up to this mark right here, which is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7/10 of a meter deep. So there's one data point right there. I know how deep it is. Now, there's ice here. I could guess how cold it is, but I will use my infrared thermometer to actually take the measurement of the water temperature. And I want to make sure that I've stirred up the water a little bit so that I'm getting an average of the temperature of the water, because it can be different temperatures whether it's up near the ice or down at the bottom. So with that, I can click and read the temperature there. I also want the air temperature, which I can do easily by going to any weather report. But I can also find some surface that is in the shade and take that temperature, and that should be identical with the air temperature. So I've got that right over here. And there we go. It's only 2 degrees warmer in the air than it is in the water. And that's it. All right. When you're monitoring a vernal pool, one of the first things you want to know is it a vernal pool? And one of the ways to know that is, does it dry down at some time, usually during the summer, and lose all of its water? Well, that can be hard to tell if you're just visiting it for the first time and it's full of water. So there are other indicators of a vernal pool. And one of them is that you don't have fish in the water, because fish don't survive well when it dries down. But you may not be able to see that there is an absence of fish. So you got to look for other indicators too. And one of them, right behind me here, is this bush. It's called button bush. It loves being in the water and is often found in vernal pools, and is an indicator that you've probably got a long hydro period pool of some kind. And that's one of the things to check for. So if you're documenting for iNaturalist, snap a picture of a button bush in your vernal pool, and that will be a strong indicator that you do have a vernal pool. Other things that you might want to look for in the water, using a dip net, if you find a macroinvertebrate called fairy shrimp. Excellent indicator that you have a vernal pool. So if you've got one of those, if one of those comes up in your net, or if you can just see it swimming in the water, then document that. And you've got a good, verifiable vernal pool, because they don't live anywhere else. Okay. Spotted salamanders use vernal pools to breed for just a few days or possibly a few weeks in late winter to early spring. They lay eggs and then go back into the forest, where they remain mostly unseen for the rest of the year. wood frogs are one of the first amphibians to breed in vernal pools. They are explosive breeders. They come in all at once, stay for just a few days, lay their eggs, and then they are gone to be out into the forest again. Eggs remain for several weeks before they hatch into tadpoles.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you, Ray. We have a minute or two left if anyone has any questions. I think we got most of them answered as we went. There was a couple that were asking about essentially inoculating vernal pools with new groups of species, such as bringing water from an existing pool, putting in a new one. I highly encourage everyone to check out our talk on vernal pool development and restoration on May 21st. But we can touch a little bit on that. Jenna, I know that has had experience with that. So if you want to just give a little quick synopsis on that, and then we can get into our virtual field trips.
Sure. So I think that fairy shrimp potentially could be transported from one pool to another to inoculate that area. If it's not a vernal pool, they won't survive throughout the year anyway, such as if there's fish there. But I don't know that it's a great idea to spread species around. So we might have to check with kind of state recommendations for any of that. Typically, we recommend that you make sure your equipment is clean so that you're not spreading anything. We try to keep systems as natural as possible, and you never know what introducing a new species will do. For example, tiger salamanders are somewhat carnivorous, I guess, and they'll eat other salamander larvae. So if you introduce that tiger salamander, it could potentially decrease the population of other species. So there are some relationships like that where you need to be careful what you introduce. Sometimes people think even releasing their pet into a natural system is helping and being kind to that animal. And then we have exploding populations of goldfish that are non-native and other animals that are not natural to that system. So that's my 2 cents. If anybody else on the Vernal Poolooza or even attendees, I know we have a lot of specialists here today. So if anybody else wants to chime in with recommendations for that, please feel free.
Yeah, and as we jump into the videos on our field trips, please feel free to use the chat to discuss and talk about all this. I know obviously we are trying to keep things as native as possible, and you know, there's the transfer of disease potentially, and you know, creating imbalance. So like I said, May 21st will be a great talk about restoration of vernal pools. So for now, I think we can jump right into our field trips. And again, please feel free to use the chat to keep talking about that. So Dale, I think you are up for the videos.
Hey everyone, Liz and Lauren here again. We're here to give you an update on the 2 vernal pools associated with preservation parks of Delaware County.
The first location is Gallant Woods Park in Delaware, Ohio. The day we went for our site visit, there was still some leftover ice and snow visible, but the air temperature was 57 degrees.
Hello, Tommy.
Even though the water was only 35 degrees, we were still seeing some activity. We stayed until after dark, used our cell phone lights, and gently sifted through the leaf litter. We found macroinvertebrates like this water scavenger beetle and this dragonfly nymph. We were also lucky enough to see a single smallmouth salamander. It's a little early in the season, but we expect to see even more after a good warm rain.
The second vernal pool location is at Dave Orndorff's property in Olive Green, Ohio. Our second site visit took place on a warm spring day at 62 degrees Fahrenheit. There, we collected data recording the water temperature and water depth. While we were a little early for peak migration, we managed to find several species of amphibians by turning over logs surrounding the vernal pool. Some of the species we spotted include Jefferson salamanders, a red-spotted newt, and a smallmouth salamander.
Dale, it doesn't look like there's sound on this one, just as a heads up.
We're here at Calamus Swamp. It's the last day of February, about 8:15 p.m. We're on the trail, walking toward the wetlands. We hear some spring peepers. There is just a slight bit of ice left. So this is a UV light. You can hardly see through the water.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's picking up the purple, but that's really cool to see.
Wild?
Here we have an organism in the Tabanidae family. This is likely a deerfly larva. And it has an off-white, cream-colored, and brown striping along each segment of its body. And it has a pretty unique way of locomoting through the wetland, undulating its body, kind of like an accordion.
The fairy shrimp were very abundant and seemed to be attracted to the light. We didn't have our macro lens on, so it's a little blurry, but you can see how numerous they are. Here is a giant water bug crawling on a stick underwater. These are hemipterans, and it's within the family Belostomatidae. And these breathe air, but they can stay underwater for long periods of time by tucking an air bubble underneath their wings in their abdomen, and then they slowly absorb the oxygen from that. They can stay underwater for over 5 minutes at a time. And you can see some of the fairy shrimp swimming all around in the foreground and background. Here's a tray of some of the critters that we found. You can see a tadpole swimming around through the water, some large scuds. These are crustaceans within the Amphipoda order, and some Planorbidea snails. These are ram's horn snails. And in the top here, you can even see a dragonfly nymph. Here we have a bullfrog. Bullfrogs can be distinguished from green frogs by the lack of a lateral fold down the body. So on the bullfrog, it wraps around the tympanum, which is used for hearing and vibrations. Here we have the chorus frog. Awesome.
Ah, here's one. Take a look here at this tiger salamander we found. This is a female.
Tiger salamanders are within the family Ambystomatidae. These are known as the mole salamanders because they spend 70 to 95% of their lives underground. They come to the vernal pool to breed at night, often during the first rain following the thaw of snow. The female will release an average of 200 eggs within a thick, firm, jelly-like mass, which is often attached to sticks or leaves in the water, often in secretive locations.
What'd you find, Lindsay?
Looks like we've got a tiger salamander.
So you can tell that this tiger salamander is a male based on the enlarged cloaca seen behind the hind limbs. And females have a smaller cloaca, but you can kind of see that enlarged area, and therefore we know this is a male. And they meet with females to breed. The males will deposit spermatophores on leaves. They will court the females with a term called dancing, in which they display and wag their tail and swim around the females. The females will then pick up the spermatophores and fertilize eggs and lay them in clusters. We didn't see any spermatophores or eggs today, but we'll check next time.
And we heard hearsay that yesterday there weren't any salamanders observed, so it could be that they're just coming to the vernal pool tonight.
We'd like to remind you that while we encourage you to visit local vernal pools around Ohio, if you're visiting a metro park or another city park, you'll need to get a permit or written permission to access that site after hours, or even to go off trail or off the boardwalk. For Calamus Swamp, you'll reach out to Columbus Audubon. They can also provide best practices for cleaning your equipment to limit transfer of any algae or other bacteria or funguses across site. Also to watch your step so you don't disturb egg masses and things like that. So just make sure that you are doing that to help keep our vernal pools safe.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you everyone for coming to our second session on our virtual Vernal Palooza. Our next one is going to be April 2nd, where we're going to be talking exclusively about amphibians. So get ready for all kinds of frogs and toads. And again, thank you everyone for coming and staying despite the technical difficulties. And we look forward to seeing you again.